Holy God, we are so thankful for this evening that we gathered together to begin your Sabbath. And Lord, we pray that you may bless each and every one of us. May your Holy Spirit will guide Elder Tess and speak through her, that we may learn your truth through her. May you bless each and all of us, enlighten our mind with whatever light that we are going to discuss tonight. And encourage us, Lord, to live it and use it in our daily life as we prepare for the coming of Christ. I thank you that you have looked after all of us during the week. And I believe that none of our members or even our families is sick or is hurting at the moment. We are all okay. And we praise you for your mercy and grace. We thank you also that you have heard us now, for we ask all this in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen.
Amen. One-sixth of the way through winter. Some may not be counting, but I am. I wanted to keep that portion at the beginning to say a few things that are separate from our study, but I think that it directly relates to our study. It kind of joins in with the theme of what we've been studying, especially the article shared last week. What I'd wanted to share was something from an article by The Atlantic about 10 days ago. And there's a writer for The Atlantic, Jennifer Senior, and she has for many months now been interacting with, texting, visiting, hanging around Steve Bannon. And she is, of course, not of his right-wing ideology, but Steve Bannon is not one to turn down any form of publicity, even when he knows that it might be negative. And she does visit him, text him, he texts her frequently, they dialogue, and she built all that into an article that she published in The Atlantic about 10 days ago, and it's all on Steve Bannon. It's titled American Rasputin. And there were some interesting points of this article. It's very long. There was a lot that I didn't want to share for time, haven't wanted to flood people with too much information at a loss for what really has to be read. I would say imperative reading, imperative watching at the moment. So I didn't share this article, but there was a portion of it that I did want to mention, especially for the people that have been interested and looking at Gamergate. She, quite a ways through the article, maybe about halfway, she says that she keeps thinking back. And by the way, for these months, she's been in close contact with Steve Bannon, so much so that when Bannon's father died in January, he invited her to his father's funeral. I think he thought it would add to the publicity, a bit of a PR stunt, so she went to his father's funeral at his request as his guest. So he has given her quite a lot of access. And as she's had that access, she's built it into this article. And she discusses what Steve Bannon means for America, particularly American democracy. He is less prominent now that he's been thrown off YouTube. A lot of those in the far right have been removed from YouTube, removed from Twitter. There's somewhat silence, but that silence can be deceptive. It can make it appear that they've gone away, and they very much haven't. In some ways, not criticizing removing him from YouTube at all, but in some ways it can make it harder to track them. But that it's still very much an active part of the far right. She says there's a scene she keeps looping back to in Errol Morris's 2018 documentary about Bannon. So in 2018, Errol Morris publishes a documentary about Steve Bannon titled American Dharma. And she keeps, as she interacts with Bannon, she keeps kind of looping back to something that she heard in that documentary. She says that in that documentary, Bannon was recalling his Hong Kong days in the 2000s when he was working for internet gaming entertainment. He notes how stunned he was to discover how many people played multiplayer online games and how intensely they played them. But then he breaks it down for Morris using the example of a theoretical man named Dave in accounts payable who one day drops dead. Some preacher from a church or some guy from a funeral home who's never met him does a 10-minute eulogy, says a few prayers, Bannon says, and that's Dave. But that's offline Dave. Online Dave is a whole other story. Dave in the game is Ajax, Bannon continues, and Ajax is like the man. Ajax gets a caisson when he dies and is carried off in a raging funeral pyre. The rival group comes out and attacks. There's literally thousands of people there, Bannon says. People are home playing the game and guys are not going to work and women are not going to work because it's Ajax. Now, who's more real, Bannon asks. Dave in accounting or Ajax? Ajax, Bannon realised. Some people, particularly disaffected men, actively prefer and better identify with the online versions of themselves. Me ad-libbing here, the online versions of themselves, because the online versions for themselves don't work in accounting. They are, as Bannon refers to, Ajax, the man. He kept this top of mind when he took over Breitbart News in 2012. So Steve Bannon was working with online multiplayer games throughout the 2000s, and he has these realizations of what is happening in these online communities. And when he takes over Breitbart News in 2012, he carries all that he's learnt with him, and he decides to build out the comments section because he sees the comments section kind of like the multiplayer games. The comments section is more of a community, says Steve Bannon, than the city these people live in, the town they live in, the old bowling league. He tells Morris, the keys to these sites is the comment section. This can be weaponized at some point in time. The angry voices, properly directed, have a latent political power. So if you've ever over the last years wondered why the comment section are so toxic, Steve Bannon and others have deliberately expanded the comment section and created those angry voices in there. As Bannon recognizes, mostly disaffected men. When you come into gaming, a lot of young men. I mentioned this to Steve Bannon the second time we spoke. On War Room, which is his current podcast, but he doesn't like it being called a podcast. On War Room, he frequently talks about three levels of participation. The posse, the cadre, and the vanguard. It sounded to me like the gamification of politics. Yes, Bannon told me, that's just it. I want Dave in accounting to be Ajax in his life. So you want to move the comment section and also the comment section of interactive gaming, you want to bring that into political reality. And that is what he recognizes in the 2000s. That is what he's doing in the 2010s. And she says, this is what happened on January 6th. The angry, howling hordes arrived as real-life avatars, cosplaying the role of rebels in face paint and fur. They stormed the Capitol while an enemy army tried to beat them away. They carried their own versions of caissons. I might be mispronouncing that. They skipped a day of work, and then they expressed outrage and utter incredulity when they got carted away. Fantasy and reality had become one and the same. I just like that connection to Gamergate, because Gamergate was not an accident. It didn't happen by accident or in some type of void. It's something that people like Bannon had recognized in the previous decade, had been working towards, and it's just kind of a flashpoint showing what is possible when you use the comment sections of especially right-wing material, but comment sections in generally, that social media influence, but especially with what formed with online games and surrounding misogyny. And then 2021, January 6th, I think her point is worth considering in the context of Gamergate, how much of that was cosplaying, how much of that was taking those avatars, taking their online Ajax, hiding behind the comment section and that anonymity. And Bannon's desire was to no longer have these people be anonymous, bring that anonymous avatar and make that the reality. And then, and you wonder why so many are so shocked when there's repercussions. I'd wanted to mention that as Gamergate has been such a subject, and I thought that that was a valuable observation. But just to identify that nothing that was happening around this history or Gamergate, nothing was just an accident. If we don't have comments on that, I want to swing, using that same article, swing back to the article that was shared last week by Open Democracy on the left wing's focus on Israel, their hyper-focus on Israel and Palestine. Because she says a couple of other things in this article, observations she's had over the months of studying and interacting with Steve Bannon and his community and his podcast. She makes a couple of other observations, and I want to use them to segue back to a little bit of what we've been discussing. We have a few people not participating tonight. If others have questions, please just put a hand up in the chat. Questions or thoughts to share, otherwise I'll go straight in. She makes another observation, and this is regarding anti-Semitism. As his podcast was thrown off YouTube for obvious reasons that I think can be obvious to us, and it currently exists on Rumble. There's a platform. It usually has, she says, tens of thousands of viewers in real time. And as that, there's a running commentary. So as she's following this commentary, she's seeing all of these comments and she's starting to see a theme. I'll repeat some of the comments she's reading. Zelensky, just another degenerate Jew. These Jews keep showing up when societies collapse. Another individual. These are all different people. The Wuhan lab was a Zionist lab. Third person. Nothing burger with Jew sauce. Fourth, Jews hate anyone that goes against the world financial machine. 5, only a matter of time until the Jews destroying this country get noticed and expelled. 6, Jews to the left, Jews to the right, stuck in the middle, Jews. She says these comments, all from different handles, by the way, are on Rumble, which carries Bannon's show live and usually has tens of thousands of viewers in real time. I didn't even venture onto Telegram, where I knew the commentary would be fouler still. I got used to it after a while, and I also came to expect it. Anti-Semitic rhetoric was the most abundant form of ugliness I saw from commenters during his broadcast, even more abundant than anything floridly racist or anti-immigrant. And then she approaches him with this because they're dialoguing everything, and he just denies it and starts listing all the Jews that he's worked with. But she starts investigating why, and she starts mentioning and bringing it to him. She doesn't hold back. The people that he has on that podcast are Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of his most ubiquitous guests. He only stopped having her on his podcast after she spoke at a conference in February where the organizer, Nick Fuentes, cheerfully praised Hitler. Her beliefs were hardly a secret before that. In 2018, she shared on Facebook a video claiming that Zionist supremacists were trying to displace white Europeans with immigrants. In other words, the Great Replacement theory. So even the Great Replacement theory, who do they believe is orchestrating it? Who do they believe is planning it and running it? Jews. So she goes into, she brings to his attention something that he's already well aware of, the anti-Semitism of the people that he has on that show. There was another person that he had on that show. I just another person he had on that show, 𝗃𝗶𝗱𝗲𝗿𝗁𝗃𝗶𝗱𝗲𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃 They keep it a little bit deniable, but what 𝗃𝗶𝗱𝗲𝗍𝗂𝗃 and others in the far right would do is if they were speaking and they wanted to reference a Jew, they would do it this way. So if I'll use myself as an example, if they thought I was Jewish and they said anything, wrote anything online, used anything as a slide, and there was the name of someone who was Jewish in that slide, they would put it in 3. It's called an echo symbol. It's creating an echo symbol. It particularly took off in 2016 when anti-Semites began to use it to identify Jews, especially Jewish journalists. It became the online equivalent of tagging an individual with anti-Semitic graffiti. So this has been very popular in the far right, using these kind of brackets to create an echo symbol around the name of anyone they're referring to who is Jewish, especially anyone who's a journalist. The American Southern Poverty Law Center called him out on this. He was called out of this, and in response to this, he published a selfie outside of Auschwitz, and he said they would be wise to remember what happened the last time people made lists of undesirables. So there is this anti-Semitic train through the far right. What I want us to consider is anti-Semitism. So just to summarize, what we did at the beginning was I went to that article. I wanted us to consider Gamergate not as a standalone accidental incident, but part of a bigger story, and that part of the bigger story relates to online gaming, those gaming communities, but also the comment section, Steve Bannon being very deliberate and observant of all of that and deliberately fomenting that, and January 6th also being connected to those attempts and to 2014. Using the same article, I wanted to go into and highlight the anti-Semitism that she spoke of in that article and just how pronounced it is within the far right. And then I wanted to ask the question, in the context of the article shared last time, I wanted to ask about Whoopi Goldberg and a comment she made earlier this year on The View. Some of you might already be aware of this, but Whoopi Goldberg said about the Holocaust, let's be truthful about it, because the Holocaust isn't about race. She said it's not about race, it's about man's inhumanity to man. Co-host Anna Navarro pointed out, but it's about white supremacists going after Jews. Goldberg says, but these are 2 white groups of people. Even in her apology, she doubled down. She said most of the Nazis were white people, and most of the people they were attacking were white people. So to me, I'm thinking, how can you say it's about race, it's about racism, when you're fighting each other? Don't write me anymore, I know how you feel, I'll take your word for it and never bring it up again. So she actually doesn't properly apologize, but she's sure in her own mind that the Holocaust was not a racist race or racist issue. It was not racism. And anti-Semitism is not racism because it's white people doing it to white people. And she essentially says they just fought it out amongst themselves. Is she right or is she wrong about anti-Semitism being a race issue? First of all, I want to ask if people think she's right or wrong, and then I want them to defend it prophetically. If I don't have hands, I'll find names. Graham.
I just wanted to point out that in the article that you were just reading by that author, she also mentioned that anti-Semitism was not racism. She listed them very separately. So I wondered if her thoughts were along those lines as well.
Can you repeat that? Sorry?
The author of the article that you were reading out about 2 minutes before were also listed that anti-Semitism was separate from racism. She seemed to list them very differently.
I noticed the same thing. She says anti-Semitism and racism, and yes, I think that there's a sensitivity around calling anti-Semitism racism.
So at the risk of, I think it's, isn't it racism?
How do you know?
How do I know that it's racism? Because I don't think it comes down to the color of a skin that determines that it's racism that Whoopi Goldberg seems to be struggling with. It seems to be trying to de-escalate a situation. You say, no, I'm not racist. Or what happened in Germany wasn't racism because it was between two people of the same color. It's almost, trying to de-escalate. I can't think of a better word than de-escalate all. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it's quite problematic to suggest the Holocaust was white people fighting it out amongst themselves. And I get the definition, what you say about the definition. I don't disagree with that. I do think that there's a prophetic reason behind that argument as well, though, a strong one. Molly.
I think it was racism because it leads to nationalism.
Yes, you see that nationalism there.
Because I remember you said before, racism always leads to nationalism and fascism.
Nationalism kind of insists on the identification of others. So I don't see how it can really avoid creating others compared to the nation that is being so celebrated. So bringing nationalism into it, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, there were two different races in one country.
Yes. Which is similar to African Americans today, isn't it? They're both in one country, but one believes that they belong and that the others don't so much belong.
Yeah, it really doesn't matter the color. It was two different races, you know?
Graham.
The trying to bring it back prophetically, I was just trying to compare it or contrast it to gender equality. And if you had two groups of women fighting and fighting against each other, you would see, you would have to label it misogyny if there was certain language or behavior being used by one group of people, and comparing that between two people of the same color and saying that it's not racism?
I might need to think about that a bit more, but it's an interesting comparison. Catherine?
Well, in the Alpha history, the Millerite history, the issue was race, and the Holocaust is the Alpha history for the counterfeit. So I would sort of line them up because they're both, you know, there's the counterfeit of the Alpha history. The other point, I guess, that I see or connection is the issue of eugenics, which sort of began that whole debate during the Millerite period. And then you can sort of thread that through to some of those German scientists. And the basis for what they were arguing was a race question, because they were arguing about those different lines of humans being different races. So I sort of see that connection too.
We go Eden to Eden. We see gender in Eden, then we see the Sabbath. Eve with gender, the Sabbath with Cain, and racism, nationalism, that beginning of organised slavery in its inception with Ham. And we've taught that since 2019. And then we see that being undone in the time of the end, post-1798. And it's working backwards. The first to be addressed is racism. And that is in the context of the United States. In that context is slavery. Then we have, in the context of 1888, the Sabbath, worship, and then we have the context in 1989 to now, gender. But we know that this Millerite history was counterfeited. So when Whoopi Goldberg says that anti-Semitism is not racism, I knew instantly that she was wrong, because our prophetic message is very, very, very clear that the issue of racism as being understood and trying to be undone in society for the true, for God's people, was Millerite history, the post-Civil War history, and then into the Civil War history, 1798 to 1863. True and counterfeit. But if it's going to be counterfeited, Satan also needs to be reviving the Catholic Church and have that issue rising up in the midst of a broad systemic issue of racism, and that is the Holocaust. We have the lead up and then into the Civil War for the true, the Holocaust for the counterfeit. Both are this. Both are that issue. So if anti-Semitism, not just as it exists today, but going back to the Holocaust, is not a race issue, then it seriously conflicts with our study of the counterfeit. And yes, I think it can be seen without the prophetic message, which is what the Levites and the Nethinims need to understand. But the left wing has this problem. The left wing struggles to understand anti-Semitism correctly. And I've used a couple of illustrations going through Steve Bannon and his podcast, The War Room, to illustrate just how prolific, to touch on very briefly, illustrating just how prolific anti-Semitism is today. But even going back then, we have to see it as racism. I do not want to distract from what is the testing issue today, gender. But I think you can see as we go through the problems with the left wing, if they don't get these issues correctly, they are incapable of understanding and responding correctly to the subject of gender. There was 31 men arrested who were preparing to riot at a pride rally, and article after article after article that I read highlighted white nationalists, white supremacists, racists over and over and over and over again. There were 31 men and they turned up to riot at a pride parade. I think the central issue that the left-wing media should have used that opportunity to dissect was not the subject of racism. It's there. That can be covered elsewhere. It can be mentioned because they are white supremacists. But the center of 31 men turning up at a pride parade is an issue with gender. And I didn't find an article I could share on it because the left wing seems immobile on the subject of gender, and I want us to see why that is. Hence sharing the last two articles the last 2 weeks. But to lead into, we have to recognize that anti-Semitism is prolific in the right wing. That barely needs proving. We need to see that many within the left wing do not believe that anti-Semitism has anything to do with racism. Our prophetic message teaches strongly otherwise. And now I want to have a look at the left wing. There was an annual report released by I just want to get the Anti-Defamation League. Sorry, I forgot what ADL stood for. The Anti-Defamation League published a report in 2021 showing that in 2020 there were 2,024 anti-Semitic incidents. Last year saw the third highest number of reports of assault, last year being 2020 for them, the third highest number of reports of assault, harassment and vandalism toward American Jews since the ADL first began tracking the data in 1979. Experts say the recent attacks are being driven more from the political left than ever before. I want to discuss the BDS movement. We'll come back to conservatism in a moment. But I just want to, I'll try and box this off. I want to just look at the BDS movement. BDS stands for boycott, divest, and sanction. Boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. They seek to mobilize international and economic political pressure on Israel in solidarity with the Palestinians. In the context of the article that was shared last week, I wanted to read from another article by the Washington Post. And this article is by Dana Milbank. He is a left-wing, not all Washington Post contributors are left-wing. Some of them follow Donald Trump, but the vast majority, he is someone that I think has written many things worth listening to from a position of being highly critical of Donald Trump and the right wing. But he put out an article that drew my attention this week because he took a break from his usual attacks on the right wing and took a swipe at the left. He brings up this movement, the BDS movement. It's titled BDS Detours into Old School Anti-Semitism. He says, this movement, which aims to boycott, divest and sanction Israel and those who do business there, has long walked a line between opposing Israel's treatment of Palestinians and fomenting hatred of Jews and Jewish culture. but now one of its affiliates has plunged headlong into outright anti-Semitic bigotry, conspiracy theories, and implicit invitations to violence. Late Tuesday, Boston's arm, so this was recent, late Tuesday, Boston's arm of the loosely organised movement urged its followers, as it had several times before, to explore an interactive mapping project, which it said would show how imperialism, racism, militarism, and Zionism are systemically connected in our communities. So they say imperialism, racism, and militarism, remember what we discussed about the far left, are systemically connected also with Zionism throughout US communities. He says it does none of those things. It doesn't show how they're connected. The BDS promoting mapping project is just the latest manifestation of an anti-Semitic canard alleging secret, hidden Jewish control of and the buying of influence over academia, the media, corporations, charities, law enforcement, and more. The project is, as Representative Seth Moulton, a Democrat, an anti-Semitic enemies list with a map attached. Its targets go beyond the usual Zionist groups to include the Synagogue Council of Massachusetts, which covers liberal congregations opposed to Israel's treatment of Palestinians, the Jewish Community Relations Council, whose affiliated groups include Holocaust survivors and Jewish war veterans, the Jewish Arts Collaborative, the Jewish Teen Foundation of Greater Boston, and even J Street, a liberal Jewish-inspired group avowedly opposing Israel's policies towards Palestinians. The creators of the map, a crazy collection of interconnecting coloured dots, called the project a resource for gathering intelligence on the agents of oppression to form our own networks of resistance. We have shown physical addresses, named officers and leaders, the map says. These entities exist in the physical world and can be disrupted in the physical world. We hope people will use our map to help figure out how to push back effectively. And how might they do that? It continues. We view US police on all levels as white supremacist, colonial institutions that have no role in our communities. We support non-cooperation, community self-defense, and resistance in all its forms. He repeats, in all of its forms. I repeatedly contacted the Palestinian BDS National Committee, the closest thing to an umbrella organisation for this movement, to ask about this implicit call to violence in all its forms, and received no reply. In the nearly 2 weeks it has known about the Boston map, the larger BDS has evidently offered no pushback. The Boston chapter couldn't be reached for comment. I contacted the Council on American Islamic Relations too, a BDS supportive rights group with which I worked to fight anti-Muslim bigotry, and was told this is not an issue we're dealing with at this time. Why not? Happily, some leaders on the left have stood against this approach. Representative Ayanna Pressley, a member of the Progressive Squad, said of the map, "It is not acceptable to target or make vulnerable Jewish institutions or organisations, full stop." I have spent much of recent years, this is Dana Milbank, I have spent much of recent years condemning the conspiracy theories, lies, hatred, and violence on the right, but the battle will never be won if the left is going to adopt the same means. In terms of the sheer size of the threat, there's no parallel. Political violence on the right is far greater in both occurrences and lethality than on the left, and he gives recent examples of which we are well aware. But there was also the man who, upset by the leaked draft of a Supreme Court opinion overturning Roe v. Wade, hatched a plot to kill Justice Brett Kavanaugh before turning himself in. There is no place in society for these acts, nor for rhetoric that motivates the unstable to do the terrible, nor is there a place for a BDS movement if it is going to use justified anger with Israel's policies to foment anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and to implicitly call for violence against agents of oppression, including Jewish entities. The mapping project is ludicrous in its attempt to implicate Jews. It includes Jewish Boston, a publication of the combined Jewish philanthropies of Greater Boston, because it, quotes, pushes propaganda which glories Israel, such as Jewish Boston helped promote the Taste of Israel 2022, which featured Boston area restaurants serving and promoting Israel's diverse culinary landscape. That's reportedly them promoting Jewish Israeli propaganda. The long list of groups systemically connected with supposed Zionist oppressors include the AFL-CIO, Apple, Google, the Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute, the Boston Globe, the City of Boston, Democrats, Senators Ed Markey and Elizabeth Warren, the FBI, the Harpoon Brewery, the Harvard Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Pfizer and Moderna, an interminable collection of businesses, universities and police departments, and seemingly every Jewish group under the sun. If the broader movement isn't willing to step in and condemn those among them fanning anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and violence against Jews, then BDS will become nothing more than rubbish. What he's highlighting and what he says is he has spent years targeting the right wing and he's not undoing any of that. But if the left wing is going to employ the same tactics, then nothing is ever going to get any better. And it's specifically around the subject of anti-Semitism and the need to see, as the article that was shared last week, why there was a Jewish state in the first place. This BDS movement has long been problematic. But I will screen share to Twitter. Some of their most active supporters. 𝗃𝗏𝗁𝗲𝗏, big win for the BDS movement, let's go. And one more tweet, just to make the point. This is from BDS's own Twitter page. Rashida Tlaib, the second US congressperson to publicly endorse the BDS movement for Palestinian rights. Thank you, Rashida and 𝗃𝗏𝗁𝗲𝗏, for standing with us on the right side of history. We're part of a growing wave for freedom, justice, and equality for all. I do not believe them. This is not what freedom, justice, and equality look like for all. It is typical of the far left's idea of what freedom, justice, and equality look like for all, and the narrow vision they're taking to that. I am not going through all of this to bring racism back into the center of this movement's message. There is a reason that we need to see sexism as the Sunday law test, the internal and external test. But when we addressed two streams of information in 2018, it's not possible to go into dissecting two streams of information without, as we immediately had to do, starting to war against conspiracy theories. And you cannot war against conspiracy theories without recognizing the open anti-Semitism that is the building blocks of almost all conspiracy theories today and for the last hundreds of years. We have to get this correctly. This intersects with foreign policy, but I'm hoping as we investigate this and dissect it, we can understand what this does to the subject of gender equality, LGBT equality. Going back to June 2019, the same author by the Washington Post has another article, and again he takes on the squad, specifically Rashida Tlaib, and he recognizes that she, more than any other, has been victimized by Trump's hateful tactics. And yet he says, why is she then using his playbook against others? On August the 1st, Tlaib announced that she had identified how Israel's occupation of Palestinian land really interacts with the treatment of Black Americans. Cutting people off from water is violence, and they do it from Gaza to Detroit, she explained to the Democratic Socialists of America. The structures we've been living under right now is designed by those who exploit the rest of us for their own profit, on issues ranging from human rights to healthcare. Making a drape's parting gesture with her hands, she continued, "If you open the curtain and look behind the curtain, it's the same people that make money, and yes, they do, off of racism." A vague they conspiring to exploit the rest of us for their own profit from behind the curtain. These anti-Semitic tropes have been used against the Jews for generations. If that weren't clear enough, Tlaib let it be known that they operate both in Gaza and Detroit, and only Jews meet that description. Tlaib went on to say the exploiters made record profit during the pandemic. An anti-Semitic conspiracy theory popular on the web. Stunning, pronounced Jonathan Greenblatt, head of the Anti-Defamation League and a former Obama White House official. We've heard this kind of ugly anti-Semitic dog whistling before, but it's appalling when it comes from a member of Congress. I just want to mention a few things that BDS believes in. Some of what they believe in. If I was to suggest any reading to consider this, it is by ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. They put out a post, an article, last month, April 5, 2022. And the whole article is just listing the left-wing, 2022 left-wing candidates' troubling rhetoric on Israel. It just goes through the left-wing candidates and what they espouse on Israel, which the Anti-Defamation League calls deeply troubling. The BDS movement is somewhat disorganized. They do that deliberately. But when looking into the views of what they have, not just them, but Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, what they have adhered to, what they've promoted in the past, I don't want to take this further for now, and if people have questions and comments, we can do that, because we're going to come back around to these same subjects. As I said before, we're kind of circling now. But they are not proposing a two-state solution. I hope that we can see that. What they have said is that there should be the liberation of Palestine all the way to the sea. What a key leader in the BDS movement has said explicitly when questioned is not a two-state solution. They want Israel as a nation dissolved. That is what is being proposed here. I don't think I'll go further into making that point now. I would come back around to studying conservatism. But I wanted us to add that to what was already discussed in the article shared last week. I've shared two articles now. One was by the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. This last article discussing the left, some people within the left wing, a significant stream within the left wing and their position with Israel. Their focus on Israel. And I've wanted to just add to that second article by taking the Atlantic article, which showed the anti-Semitism of the right wing and just how horrific a problem it is today. Go back to Whoopi Goldberg's comments some months ago, and a segment of the left wing who don't believe that it's racism show why they are prophetically wrong, then tied into the left wing and specifically what are unfortunately called the squad. Because I'm going to put the squad in here too, if that isn't kind of obvious by now. There's some problems with the Bernie Sanders faction. Do we have any thoughts or comments so far? Josephine.
In the article, it used the word one-dimensional anti-imperialism. Can you just go over and explain that a little bit more in the context of what we're doing?
This was in the article shared last week.
It's in the article singling Israel. Or if I'm taking us away from the point you're trying to make, then we can put that on hold.
I probably don't want to go into too much with the articles because I kind of want to combine them.
Okay.
Combine at the end to make a few points. I think I just pulled it up in the good thing about having a PDF is you can word search. So I found the spot that I think you're referring to. One, it begins, as important as these changes have been, however, a counterproductive tendency has also gained traction, one that can best be characterized as one-dimensional anti-imperialism. This is a selective and deeply essentialist perspective that, in a curious inversion of Eurocentrism, so instead of being Eurocentric, they've kind of inverted that. They believe imperialism to be an exclusively Western phenomenon that emanates inexorably from Western capitals. And then it sees imperialism as the sole source of the world's ills. And obviously all of that has significant implications to when we say, as radical feminists, that gender is the deepest, oldest form of discrimination today. And when we talk about the extent of the ills it creates in the world, one of the excuses that China has used to deny or justify the Uyghur genocide is the idea that they cannot be committing genocide, they cannot be racists because they are not Western Europeans, they are not white in that context. So China has very deliberately used this exact argument, saying imperialism is a Western phenomenon. I think what this article is saying is that some members of the left agree with China. If I could use Max Blumenthal again, Max Blumenthal agrees with China, which is why he's incapable of condemning Assad, condemning China for genocide. If I use China as an example, does that make more sense, Josephine?
Now say that again about China. I need just...
The author of this article is saying that the factions of the left wing that we have been speaking about, and there are more in than is what listed on the board by far, they see imperialism as the sole source of the world's ills, and they see that imperialism, modern colonialism, also as a purely Western phenomenon. So the rest of the world is incapable of imperialism, is incapable of that kind of behavior that they identify and condemn in the West. China uses that. China claims, has used as a defense, that because they have suffered colonialism in the past, but because some of their members have experienced racism in the past, they cannot be accused of being imperialistic today. They cannot be accused of committing genocide. And someone like Max Blumenthal, that is where he agrees with China. That's where he agrees with Russia. That's where he agrees with Syria. There's a lot of criticism for the imperialism of the West, but he comes to the point where he and many others actually deny the Uyghur genocide is taking place, has taken place. Does that make more sense, Josephine?
Yes, yes.
They're saying it is a purely Western phenomenon, and they're saying that it's the sole source of the world's ills. And that is the viewpoint of a heavy part of the left. either to a large degree or sometimes to smaller degrees. So they're going to see Israel, condemn Israel, have this focus on Israel because they see Israel as imperialism. And the argument is, he is saying, and I want to draw out when he says misogyny and patriarchy, other issues that they demote to secondary positions or ignore entirely, especially misogyny. Where are they condemning misogyny? Because I think they should take a close look at the lives of Palestinian women. I have, and I didn't sleep well that night, or the nights that I continue to do so. But they don't have that focus. And if we're following a prophetic message, we are unavoidably clashing with these elements of the left wing. And my problem is we are clashing within this movement because that mentality, that ideology, as exhibited through the Bernie Sanders camp, through many of the people, social commentators today who speak about that because it's much easier, it's much more popular to speak about that. I think it's often just very lazy journalism. It's easier to get people to see that 31 men are just really bad news if you just take it as a racial issue rather than take the time to actually dissect why there were 31 men and why they were at a pride rally. And the homophobia, all of which relates to gender that intersects with that incident. It's a mixture of laziness, but there's also a warped perspective of issues. That is the core issue that we're doing this entire exercise to see. That's why I shared the article 2 weeks ago by the UN Human Rights Commissioner, because he's making that point. Are human rights universal or not? Or are we saying that some human rights are universal and other human rights are culturally specific, culturally relative? And very few people on the left are willing to say that racial issues are culturally relative. It's a different story when it comes to gender. We're doing all of this to bring it back to gender. And why Hillary Clinton had to be the candidate in 2016. Why did it have to be Hillary Clinton? Because for Max Blumenthal, she is a neoconservative. He's adamant. She is as bad news as George Bush, no better than George Bush. She's a neoconservative. For many within the left wing, they have more time for Steve Bannon than they have for Hillary Clinton. She's hated. So why did God choose her? Why is she the embodiment of a 2016 test on equality? If people go down this route of the left wing, they come to a position where they are incapable of dissecting gender equality when we get this close to the Sunday law. We are close. And when we get this close to the Sunday law and we can't sift the left wing, we might as well have fallen at 2016. We're not getting the point of gender equality. We're not getting the point of universal human rights in the context of gender equality. So we need to see what is wrong with the left wing. Is that okay, Josephine? Did you have any other?
Yes, thank you very much. You clarified a lot of things in my mind. Yeah, appreciate that very much.
Nancy Pelosi has had to fight the squad. And I think it's been too easy in the past to say the squad's fighting for equality and then there's just the centrists. And on some things they are centrists. On some things they're doing the wrong thing, Nancy Pelosi, Biden. But if people want to actually focus on the subject of gender equality, then it's a little more complex than that. And I would argue that the squad is doing nothing for gender equality today. Hillary Clinton was the answer prophetically Are we following prophecy, or are we following how we feel about these issues? Are we following what's popular on the left, or are we being governed by prophetic message? I won't say more about the BDS movement or about that anti-Semitism today, but I would just repeat again, they're not proposing a two-state solution. What they are proposing is the dissolution of Israel as a country. And the article I shared illustrates why they think that is necessary. The imperialist project that they considered the state of Israel to actually be created upon, and whether or not they're recognizing that anti-Semitism is the issue that it has been and exists today. If we want to talk about racism as an issue in this history, then in 1888, why do US conservatives want to change, not just institute a Sunday law in 1888, they want to change the US Constitution. Why the Constitution? Because a little group of American, probably mostly born and bred American Seventh-day Adventists were never the target in 1888. They need to change the Constitution because the Sunday law will take care of the Jews, and a change to the Constitution will take care of the Catholics. It's anti-immigration. They're trying to protect their America, their cultural class, from immigrant Jews and immigrant Irish Catholics. That's the story of 1888. So you can see that racism play out all through that history. But we've come back to this for a reason, and we're not going to get to the point of gender unless we can see that in 2016 there's Hillary Clinton and there's Bernie Sanders, and he was never the solution. Not just him, but 𝗃𝗏 𝗏, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they were never the solution. In fact, when it comes to the left wing, they very quickly become part of the problem when we get this close to the Sunday law. Graham.
It seems that with the example that you've given of the BDS movement or the far left wing, that you have identified that their anti-Semitism is conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theories are a tool used by both the left wing and the right wing, and the way that they are being used, in particular to what we're studying, is to increase that gap of gender equality. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, and I think the quote, if I'm understanding you correctly, I think the quote that Josephine brought us to, how I understand the point of intersectionalism, and I will discuss intersectionalism, has to be properly defined and in its right context. I don't believe that that is always done correctly. But I do believe in intersectionalism, but there is a point why it was Hillary Clinton. And how the left, how many women have been abused, tortured, raped, killed in Assad's war, in Putin's war? What does Max Blumenthal have to say about that? Have a look into the lives of Palestinian women. It's not an easy story. It's also not easy to understand because there's very little information, because it's not right in their culture and society to go to the police. It has to be dealt with in the home. So a lot of it is deeply undercover. But where are their comments? It is reflective of their focus, the focus of their attention, what they think is the underscoring issue today. One-dimensional anti-imperialism, a selective and deeply essentialist perspective that believes imperialism is an exclusively Western phenomenon and sees imperialism as the sole source of the world's ills, demotes other forms of oppression to a secondary position or ignores them entirely. I think more often than not, once you start going to the left, it just ignores them pretty much entirely. it's against this backdrop that the left's over-attunement to Israel must be understood. It's not that we don't understand the needs of Palestinians, but you have to put it in context. You just take that out of context. You take that, everything that they have to say and write about it and their perspective on everything, and you take that out and look at it in reality, and it cannot line up with our prophetic message. It already clashes just here. 100 years ago. Is that okay, Graham?
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Quoting ADL again from their article on left-wing candidates espousing troubling rhetoric on Israel. They say, kind of as a conclusion, and I would encourage us to actually read what they're highlighting, the suggestion that the Jewish state should not exist, a call nearly never directed at any other country, is often an outcome of the white supremacist allegation. Intimating that Israel should not exist would be threatening to any community that you tell should not exist. But it's deeply unsettling to the majority of American Jews who are reminded of the annihilationist goals of Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, and who hear echoes of centuries-old calls for the expulsion of Jews from locales across the globe. So there is this consistent not calling for a two-state solution. They're calling for the end of the Jewish state in its entirety. And if we think that is equatable, that the sins of Israel can just be compared to some of the things occurring in other communities, then I suggest we go back and we read what Iran has said about Israel, what Hezbollah has said about Israel, what Hamas has said about Israel and about Jews. And you want to dissolve any protections for that country, then I'm sorry, you're going to experience another 6 million deaths. That's the reality of what would take place. I think it's an incredible amount of ignorance, and bigotry and racism do exist in ignorance. Millions of people, the vast majority of the left wing recognizes that racism can exist just through ignorance. Well, there is no excuse for ignorance on anti-Semitism. Again, this isn't to make anti-Semitism the core point of our prophetic message. It's not. But these people are incapable of dealing with sexism and gender equality worldwide today because of this issue that they have. We only have a few minutes left, and no other hands up. So I won't go further into paleoconservatism or neoconservatism today. I will just remind us that the reason that this faction of the left wing come into agreement with the very portion of the right wing that is forming the Sunday law. So you want to go to Steve Bannon, you want to go to Tucker Carlson, the right wing voices that are driving us towards the Sunday law. Those voices are where this faction of the left wing comes into agreement with. They unify. Why this faction of the right wing? It's because they are anti-imperialist and they are isolationist. And anti-imperialism and isolationism aren't that dissimilar. They're different in their motivations. This hating US imperialism because they believe it's the deepest and sole source of the world's ills today. And this isolationist because USA, glorious land. What they do is the following. They see the United States. And what are we supposed to do? For example, when we take the United States and Russia, I have said in the past, it's like a globe. And there's a North Pole and there's a South Pole. So there's a king of the North and there's a king of the South. And the North Pole and the South Pole kind of look the same. So Donald Trump looks like Vladimir Putin. Same thing. King of the North, King of the South. United States, Russia, same. Compare. But that's just one application. Then you have the United States equals the glorious land. You can't say that about Russia. So what's different? This is a compare. This is a contrast. And that's something that these don't do. Erased it. The right wing doesn't do. Neither of them are able to correctly compare and contrast. This side can compare the United States with Russia. This side, that faction of the left wing, says the United States is no better than Vladimir Putin. The United States is no better than Assad. In fact, Assad looks really good compared to this imperialistic West. It's no better than China. They do all this comparing. Bernie Sanders stands up in Congress and says, you want to attack Russian oligarchs? USA has oligarchs. Maybe while you're complaining about all the corruption of US oligarchs, maybe you should of Russian oligarchs, maybe Congress should condemn the United States oligarchs. He makes good use of the comparison, but what happens when he doesn't contrast? What happens is a whole lot of Bernie Sanders supporters think, that's interesting, because we know Russian oligarchs kill people. We know Russian oligarchs operate in a deep state with Vladimir Putin. We know that Russian oligarchs control the media. Wait a minute, the Washington Post is owned by a US oligarch. Wait a minute, if Russian oligarchs are like USA oligarchs, maybe there's a deep state, and what just formed is an in existence real-life pipeline between Bernie Sanders supporters and QAnon. How does that happen? Compare and don't contrast. USA has a problem with billionaires. I don't like Elon Musk's work much either, but there is a contrast between Elon Musk and a Russian oligarch. Trail of dead bodies is just one of them. But he can compare, he cannot contrast. And what that sets up the left to do is major issues with foreign policy, but when you bring it down to gender, they are incapable of addressing worldwide sexism, especially when the Sunday law needs to come down to the deepest level of culture. Cultures worldwide, no exception. Tucker Carlson is going to contrast United States, rubbish countries, rest of the world, let them fight it out and kill each other. Don't care. What did Donald Trump say about the sand and dirt of the Middle East? USA, glorious. Can't do anything wrong. It's all contrast. I've spent a lot of time comparing the United States to these places because there's been a lot of nationalism that's had to be dealt with in the late 2018 through 2019 time period. I do not take back what has been taught, but if you don't contrast, if you just think that the Russian oligarchs are the same as Elon Musk, what you have is a left-wing to QAnon pipeline. All of that impacts seeing gender equality today. Ray?
I'm really sorry. I should have written down my question because I've forgotten it.
That's fine. It might come back to you. I'll make one last point, one last example. George Bush recently had a little bit of a slip up when he talked about the horrific illegal invasion of a sovereign country, Iraq. He meant to say Ukraine and he said Iraq. Deep in his brain, he must have been thinking about how, I would suggest, about his own 2003 problematic history. And it's so easy to jump on that and say, yes, he's responsible for the same as Vladimir Putin. What Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine, George Bush is doing in Iraq. That's good as a comparison. But we should not forget to contrast. Josephine, and then I'll come back to that point of needing to correct my thoughts.
I was just going to mention about Steve Bannon and his fighting his culture war. When I heard you talking about when he was running the campaigning for Donald Trump, and that's what the left is doing. They're actually fighting a culture war. Is that correct or wrong?
Yes, there is this culture war, but the left wing is not all of this. There are many voices in the left fighting them. One that I think wrote a really good article this last week, because he's been fighting with the grey zone, in the New Statesman, an article by, I don't have a subscription with them, but they do give a few free articles, so I was able to open it. But it's by Paul Mason, titled "Empower the People to Win the War on Disinformation. The left should champion state and community action to challenge the lies of its own pro-Kremlin fringe." Paul Mason is quite left-wing. He's fighting the grey zone right now over their support for the Kremlin. So this isn't all of the left wing, but there is this culture war. I'm hoping that going into this doesn't overcomplicate it to people, that they can't still see that the left wing has the answer. It has the point of equality, but that equality has to be understood correctly. First of all, recognizing where inequality exists. Is that okay, Josephine?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
I don't want us to think this is all the left wing. It's certainly not. Paul Mason wrote a good article on the left wing, disinformation and the Kremlin. Bringing it back to the Iraq war, Saddam Hussein, he takes over Iraq. He sits in a room of about 100 members of his own Ba'athist political party are in this room with him, and he starts recounting a story of a conspiracy that he believes exists within his own political party to oust him from power. He starts railing against his political party. He then has dragged to the front of the room a man who has quite evidently been tortured to within an inch of his life. And this tortured man starts to call out in the room, alleging that this conspiracy against Saddam Hussein was true, and then calling out names of members of the Ba'athist party who were supposedly part of this conspiracy to oust Saddam Hussein, whether or not there was such a plan to oust him from leadership or not. As he calls out their names one by one, people come in, soldiers grab the name he calls out and drag that man outside. He keeps calling out names till about 50 of the 100 party members have been removed from the room. By that stage, the last 50 are desperate. They're shouting from their seats support for Saddam Hussein, begging him to believe them, that they support him, that they would never try and oust him, fearful that their name will be the next on the lips. Saddam Hussein says, "Okay, you want to support me, prove it." He then has soldiers come in and hand guns to those 50 remaining members and say, if you are going to support me, you go outside and you shoot and kill all of the members of your political party that I just had dragged out. And he made them do that. Made them. They could have chosen not to. They would have, I'm sure, been murdered as well if they hadn't. That is not Ukraine. And that is not making a racist point that an Iraqi is not equal, life is not equal to a Ukrainian citizen, or that the United States did the right thing in Iraq. It did not. But if you don't contrast and see Am I sad he's gone from power? No. But Saddam Hussein is not Zelensky, and Zelensky is not perfect. We have to compare, and we also have to contrast. What the United States did was wrong. I do believe that what was motivating the United States is not the same thing as what is motivating Vladimir Putin. What is motivating Vladimir Putin is not the same thing that motivated George Bush. Also, Vladimir Putin is still in power and George Bush is not. Another contrast. George Bush has faced much criticism from his country, and those citizens who have criticized him are not rotting in jail cells. Vladimir Putin's is. You have to compare and contrast if you're going to say the United States is the same as Russia and Iraq is the same as Ukraine. You have to compare and you have to contrast. That does not leave you nationalistic. That does not leave you justifying the United States' mistakes, but it puts things into a perspective where you can then step in and handle the subject of gender equality correctly. Afghanistan is another example. I know I'm handling deeply painful, sensitive topics, and I am conscious of the deep danger of being misunderstood. And I don't want to be misunderstood. I very much don't want to be misunderstood. I'm hoping that you can give me the benefit of the doubt if you think I'm saying something that is deeply problematic. But just to step back and adhere to our own prophetic rules, compare and contrast. Understand the test that gender is today, and I can keep repeating myself, gender is the test, gender is the test, gender is the test. Hillary Clinton was the candidate, Hillary Clinton was the solution. I can keep repeating that, but it's not just a fact on its own, it's a fact with evidence to back it up, and it's a fact that properly understood has deep implications to our entire worldview. It's not just accepting it as a fact, it's understanding why it is that way. Why gender is the test. Not just that it is, but why it is. Why Hillary Clinton was the solution. Not just that she was the solution, but why she was. Not just that she's a woman. You could not have put Ilhan Omar in that position in 2016 and have said the same thing. God knows why Ipsos identified her. We'll come back around to this next week. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Next week, I want to get back to the conservatives, paleoconservatism, and what paleoconservatism means and where it came from. If you'll kneel with me. Dear Lord, sometimes it feels like we're just delving into the darkness. These subjects are painful, they are horrific. The suffering on this planet is horrific, but so much of the suffering of women occurs behind closed doors, is silenced, is shamed, is seen as private, a family matter, or culturally relative. I pray as we investigate these subjects that we will be prepared for the Sunday law, where it conflicts with thinking that has perhaps developed over many years or over the last few years, that we will get better at sifting material, that we will take care, that we handle external events, the whole external world, but also internally, the way we relate to women in this movement, the way we relate to gender issues, all these subjects within this movement, how we relate to cultural practices within this movement, that we will do them in light of a prophetic message, that we might be prepared as a movement, as a group, for a new kingdom, to leave that behind which conflicts with your government. I pray, Lord, that you'll help to do that with unity as a group, supporting one another. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.